Welcome back to Reading Bear. Today, we will take a look at some new ProRevenge stories. And if you enjoyed my content, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and post some bear emojis in the comments. Let's go!
The first one is titled, I've been told you'd like to hear about my grandmother. My grandmother got married in 1962 to a young man in the military. For a wedding present, their parents bought them a house in a nice suburb. White picket fence, whole 9 yards. Not long after they moved in, the next door neighbor planted a mulberry tree on the side of his property, near my grandparents' driveway. Nothing seemed amiss, but if you know mulberry trees, you know that shit is about to get real. About 15 years later, the mulberry tree was obnoxious. The birds would come and eat the berries, and any car parked in the driveway would get shit on, and it would stain the cars and ruin paint jobs. My grandmother, upon realizing the culprit, baked a nice apple pie, walked next door, and asked the neighbor if he'd mind trimming back the branches of the tree that hung over her driveway. He told her not to worry, he'd get to it soon. 3 days later, my grandmother opened her door to find a half-eaten pie in the plate, crawling with ants, and a note that said, "I changed my mind." My grandmother threw out the pie, cursing up a storm, and swearing up and down she'd get him to trim that tree or get him back. City ordinance said she could not trim the tree, as the roots were on his property, so the whole tree was his property. As the years went by, my grandmother repeatedly asked him, ever so nicely, to trim it back. His responses were always along the lines of no and duck off. Finally, in the mid-90s, my grandmother retired, and received a large bonus from her employer for her 35 years of work. She took the money, and bought the empty lot on the other side of the neighbor, then went to a nursery and bought 16 mulberry trees, planting them along her property line, on both sides of his property. About 3 years ago, he became angry at the damage they were doing to his cars, and cut them all back without permission. My grandmother took him to court, and he was forced to reimburse her for the trees at a markup because they'd had 10 years to grow. The next one is titled, She Thought She Could Get Away with a Bad Back. Backstory: in the early 2000s I worked for an overpriced CD store. I really liked my job aside from one co-worker, Karen. We just didn't get along. I made the best of it, but she was a borderline bully. Of course, she gets promoted to keyholder and proceeds to turn into a full-blown power trip bully. She made my life hell, and a job that I previously loved I couldn't stand anymore. I made a formal complaint that made its way to HR, but I was done working there, which was her goal. Of course, when HR investigated my claims, they found she and the assistant manager were dating, and she was moved to another store since fraternizing was against policy. Apparently she didn't like that store and quit. A few months later I was happily working at defunct bookstore, and who gets a job at the defunct bookstore at another mall? Karen. Over the next few months, she proceeds to do little things to annoy me, like hanging up when I would call their store for a customer, or leave me on hold forever. Of course, I would get in trouble for not effectively handling the customer with their needs. The revenge: about 6 months into the job, I heard through the grapevine of store gossip that Karen had been injured in a car accident. Apparently she had hurt her back and went on medical leave. She couldn't stand for more than 10 minutes at a time without excruciating pain. This is important. She was on indefinite leave, and her store could not hire anyone to replace her while on medical leave, leaving them short-handed. And I knew her manager was really annoyed after a few months. 2 months later a few friends of mine and I decided to go play pool. A former co-worker, Rick, from the overpriced CD store was there. Rick: man, too bad you weren't here last night. It would have been a reunion. Karen and assistant manager were here playing pool. Me: Karen was playing pool? Rick: oh yeah. They come in every Wednesday night. Me: really? That's interesting. Every Wednesday, huh? How long has this been going on? Rick: a few months now. Yes, for the entire time she was on medical leave, Karen was out playing pool once a week, not at home in debilitating pain like she claimed. The next day I went to her defunct bookstore and asked to speak to the manager. I told him all about her weekly pool sessions and encouraged him to be at the pool hall the next Wednesday night to catch her in action. That Thursday she was fired. The last time I saw her, she and her friend were attempting to follow me home from work. I called the police and led them into the police station, where they told her to leave me alone or be arrested. She stayed away from me after that. The next one is titled, Don't Want to Pay for the Work Done, Have a Dead Yard. I had recently lost my job, like most people at the time, and was having to do odd jobs on Craigslist just to get by. I recruited a friend to help me do the various odd jobs since he was in a similar situation. We pooled our resources and cobbled together enough equipment to do landscaping work along with other odd jobs that you'd hire manual labor for. We were both young, like early 20s, and didn't really know when we were getting scammed or fooled. We got a call on one of our ads to go do some landscaping work for a guy who happened to live about a mile away. Awesome. We won't have to spend much on gas, but we will have to sacrifice our Labor Day weekend to do the job since it was a large job. The guy asked us to put in a raised bed that essentially wrapped around his entire house. Imagine a house in a newly built subdivision that has a smallish yard and few trees. He wanted the bed to be built with landscaping bricks and wanted us to copy a style that his neighbor had done. Cool, no problem. We try to discuss payment, but he keeps giving us the runaround. Because we were in a desperate situation, we get fooled into doing the work with no agreed upon labor fee. This was our mistake, one that was never made again. We were just happy to have some work. We spent 2 full days working our asses off in the middle of summer, not really knowing what we were getting paid. We were using our tools, truck, and time, grinding away, but we kept wondering why this guy was acting so shady. Finally, on day 3, near the end of the day, I'm fed up with the runaround and knock on the door and confront the guy about payment. He starts getting all aggressive and starts threatening us with non-payment, which immediately escalates the situation. I grab my friend and bring him into the argument. After about 30 minutes of arguing, the guy decides he will pay us $70 for the work. Yeah, 70 ducking bucks to split between us after 3 days of labor. Cool, duck us right. We loaded up our truck with the tools, then wait for the guy to come out with our cash. This asshole comes out with a huge wad of cash, but proceeds to still only hand over $70, idiot. We collect our money and grab our last item, a tarp. We had been using a really large tarp to put weeds, grass, and extra dirt on to make our lives easier since we didn't have a wheelbarrow at the time. The accumulated mound on this thing had to have been 4 feet high. We drag it into the middle of his front yard and dump the tarp. This is the first duck you. He was begging us not to do it, but he could eat a dick at this point. We load up and peel out because, you know, angry youngsters. Now for the pro-revenge part. My friend's mum was a real landscaper. She heard our story and offered up some excellent revenge advice. Take the backpack sprayers we had, fill them with a warm saltwater mix, then ride over and spray his yard. We planned to do this about 2 months later. When the time came, we executed the plan late at night, around 2 a.m. We parked down at the pool parking lot, walked down to his house, and absolutely bombed this dude's yard. We came back about a month later and everything was dead or dying, flowers, grass, small trees, all of it. Duck with the guys that are doing your yard work? Duck your yard. The next one is titled, She Gave Him the Reference He Deserved, Not the One He Asked For. When I was a sophomore in high school, I was dating this guy. Let's call him Jack. He was this brooding guy in the Spanish class, and I was super into the whole mysterious, not talking to anyone, not caring vibe. Once we started dating, things were pretty cool. He was nice and funny, but he would make little comments all the time that just wasn't okay. For example, I didn't like cursing back then. So when he would say duck, I would ask him to stop, and he would just say, why the duck should I ducking stop saying duck? Over the next few months, things got worse and worse. He didn't want me talking to boys, which I accepted as him just being a jealous boyfriend. But then, he didn't want me talking to girls either, because he thought I would badmouth him. When I talked to girls in front of him, he accused me of talking in code about him, even though I was only saying things like, oh, that test in math was hard, right? Then came the emotional manipulation. When we could get into arguments, he would storm out of my house and cause scenes in front of my neighbors, forcing me to just agree to whatever he wanted so that he would stop making me look bad in front of others. He would say things like, oh, if you loved me, you would do this. One time, I tried to break up with him, and he ran to my house 10 miles away to make sure that I felt guilty enough to stay with him. Not long after all of this came the physical stuff. He would throw things, hit me, he even punched a hole in my wall. That was fun trying to come up with an explanation for my parents. 10 months after we started dating, I finally ended it after he sexually assaulted me. I told my parents everything, and they made sure that I was able to break up with him without him guilting me into backing out. What I didn't realize was that, during the sexual assault, he'd taken pictures. The next day at school, he threatened to show them to everyone, his friends, my parents, teachers, college admissions, everyone. I told one of my rather intimidating friends about it, and she made sure to put a stop to that. She ended up hunting him down, beating the crap out of him, and forcing him to delete the pics. She was the best, and I made sure to buy her a burger for that. He'd also lent me his graphing calculator for algebra. You know, the ones that cost like $200. He told me that he didn't want it back, but that he wanted the money to buy a new one. He also wanted $500 for all of the pizza, dinners, etc. that he'd bought me over our relationship. I said duck that, bagged up all of the stuff he'd lent me, and put it in his locker. When I got home that night, the bag was sitting on my front porch. I ended up driving to his house and giving the stuff to his parents, making sure to explain that, while he bought me food, I also bought him food, so I didn't owe him sh*t. All of that is a long-winded way to say that this guy sucked. Fast forward about a year. I was in therapy, taking medicine, and doing much better after that entire ordeal. I hadn't spoken to him at all, and things were great. Then, I get a call from him. Now, Jack's dream was to join the Marines. He'd been training with a Marine recruiter for nearly 2 years, getting in shape, making sure he was up to standard to join. As much as I hated him, I have to admit that he worked his butt off for that. When Jack called me, he asked me to be a character reference for him. Why he asked me, I have no ducking idea. After all the crap he did, you'd think he would have wanted me as far away from the recruiting people as possible. Nonetheless, he asked. So, I did what any good friend would do, and I told him, sure. I'd be happy to be your reference. He said great, and told me the stuff to say once the recruiting officer called. Stuff like, Jack's an upstanding person, very loyal, very strong, very hardworking, a great guy to have in the Marines. I said no problem and hung up. 2 weeks later, I get the call. Sergeant whatever asked me a couple of questions, like how did I know Jack, did I think he would be a good fit for the Marines, what kind of person was he, etc. You better believe that I told that guy everything. I told him about the emotional manipulation, the physical abuse, the sexual abuse, all of it. In painstaking detail. The sergeant was pretty quiet through all of this. Just listening, jotting everything down I imagine. At the end of the call, he said, thank you for telling me all of this. I'll be honest, that's not what I was expecting to hear. But I appreciate your honesty. That's not the kind of person we want in the Marines. I agreed with him on that point, and we hung up. Never talked to Jack again after that. Last I heard, he's working at McD's, still in our podunk hometown. I guess my character reference didn't help him get into the Marines. Whoops. The last one is titled, His Dad Waited for the Perfect Moment to Get Revenge. So for Christmas one year my parents got us season passes for Six Flags. We used those passes often throughout the summer as a family and had an amazing time. It was one of these days that it happened. We waited in line for one of the more popular lines which were at the 45-minute wait point. This was relatively good for this ride as you can wait for up to an hour and a half at its busiest points. We got into line excited to share this ride with our dad as it's one of the few he can ride as he has a bad back injury that makes just walking around extremely painful at times. We were in line laughing and making jokes while watching the little TVs they have at various points in the line when a group of people rudely cut us and stood in front of us. Our dad has a habit of not letting things slide, so we all braced for cover waiting for our dad to go off on these people for cutting us when to our surprise he didn't say anything. With confused looks, we turned to our dad wondering why he hadn't told them off and to get behind us. He just looked at us with a look in his eyes saying, wait for it. We shrugged it off and continued our wait. We didn't make it too far into the line at this point, so it was still about a 45-minute wait. As we got closer to the front of the line we got more and more excited waiting to get on the ride with our dad and have a great time. The way the line is set up is before you get into the loading station there is a two-way staircase that has the regular line on one side and the fast pass line on the other, and at the top of the stairs there are workers making sure the people in the fast pass line are supposed to be there. This is where my dad strikes. After waiting the 45 minutes in line behind the cutters we stood at the top of the stairs and my dad signaled for a worker's attention. Once he received it he pointed to the group that had cut us and calmly stated that they had cut us at the beginning of the line. The work then politely told the group they would need to leave the line and go back to the beginning. They were upset but followed the instructions and left the line. The worker thanked my father for informing them, and suddenly pieces pushed into place in our mind. Our dad purposely waited until the very last minute to make him have to wait another 45 minutes, plus more time as the line was longer now that it was later in the day and more people arrived. I couldn't help but laugh as I watched them walk out of the line and back towards the beginning, and just hope that they learned their lesson not to cut after that. Thanks for listening.